Good morning, class. This is Karuna Deshmukh from the Department of English of Bahirji Smarak Mahavidyalaya, Basmat Nagar of Hingoli district, and the college is affiliated to Swami Ramananda Tirtha Marathwada University, Nanded. In today's video, I'm going to talk about how to study a poem, especially from the point of view of a learner of the compulsory English course, right? Um, in the last video, I discussed uh, the study of a short story from the learner's point of view, and today I'm going to talk about a poem. How to study a poem easily. So when you look at the poem, you look at the text, right? That is written in front of you. Maybe it's a book or maybe it's the web page. Because these days, because of the pandemic, schools and colleges are being run online. So you don't have much opportunities to have the books, the hard copies in your hands. So but there is ample material available on Google. So you go to you just have to Google and find out whatever poem is prescribed for your syllabus. So when you look at the poem, what you should do is look at the form of the poem, look at the shape of the poem, look at the structure of that poem. So what I mean by the form and structure of the poem is the stanza form, how many lines are there in a poem, etc. So this is the structure of the poem. For example, if you see that a particular poem is made up of 14 lines, then you should come to the conclusion that it's a sonnet, because sonnet is a poem that is made up of 14 lines, right? So how many lines are there, and all these lines are divided into some stanzas. There is a fixed number of stanzas in a poem, and again we have to look at the stanza form. For example, a stanza of just 2 lines is known as a couplet. A stanza of 3 lines is known as a tercet. Stanza of 4 lines is known either as a quartet or quartain. Stanza of 4 lines, quartet or quartain. If there are 6 lines in a stanza, that becomes a sestet. In case there are 8 lines, the stanza becomes an octave. So after counting the lines in a poem, we have to concentrate upon the structure of the stanza. So how many lines are there in one stanza, and we have to decide the stanza form, right? So this is about the stanzas, the division of a poem in different parts, in different sections. In poetic language, as far as the study of poetry is concerned, it is known as a stanza. Then after studying, after having a look at the stanza structure, we have to find out the rhyming pattern of a particular poem. What kind of rhyme is there? What is this rhyme? Rhyme is the arrangement of the sounds in such a way that it creates a fixed pattern and a kind of rhythm in a poem. We have to concentrate upon the last sound of, say, one line and the last sound of the second line or the third line or the fourth line. And is there any connection? Are there any similarities between the use of a particular sound which occurs at the end of a line? So that is known as, for example, in case there is a quartet, that is the stanza of 4 lines, and the last sound of the first line rhymes with, is similar to the last sound of the third line, and the last sound of the second line is similar to that of the last sound of the fourth line, then the rhyming pattern is ABAB. Right? If we say that the first the last sound of the first line is, say, for example, A, and the last sound of the second line is, for example, B. So when there is the match between the last sound of the first line and the last sound of the third line, and again the last sound of the second line is exactly like the last sound of the fourth line, then the rhyming pattern is ABAB. So this is about the rhyme. Now again, as far as the rhyme is concerned, it is not necessary that each and every poem has a fixed rhyme, right? Sometimes there is no rhyme, and that is known as the free verse. Especially in case of modern poetry, the poets they rather neglect this rhyming business. They don't care for the rhyme. Okay, in traditional poetry, poets were much attentive regarding the rhyme. So this is the stanza structure, rhyming pattern, how many lines are there in a poem, and depending upon that, there is the type of that poem is there. After this, let us try to find out what figures of speech are used in that particular poem. Now, what are the figures of speech? That is the figurative language, because we know that the language of poetry is essentially different from that of the language of prose or the language of drama. Why? Because it's an ornamentative language. There are various ornaments in language also. Those are known as the figures of speech. For example, metaphor, for example, simile, personification, allegory. Then there are the figures of speech related to the sounds, like alliteration. Alliteration is when the same consonant is repeated in a line, in a particular line. That figure of speech becomes alliteration. For example, there is a very beautiful poem by William Blake. The title of that poem is Tiger, and the line is Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. So when you utter this language, when you recite this poem, or when you listen to somebody reading this poem, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, which sound gets repeated? That is t, 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 tiger, tiger, burning bright, and b is also repeated. So t and b, these are the consonants, right? And when a consonant is repeatedly used in a particular line, it gives a musical effect to that particular poem. So this becomes a figure of speech, and that is known as alliteration. When, on the other hand, a vowel is repeated in a particular line, that is known as assonance. Many times what happens is that even the teachers and learners, they mistakenly define alliteration as the repetition of the same sound. No, alliteration is the repetition of the same consonant, whereas assonance, assonance, assonance is the repetition of the same vowel, because sounds, that is the speech sounds, are of two types: vowels and consonants. So when vowels get repeated, we get a figure of speech, we get a musical effect that is known as assonance, and when the consonant is repeated, we get a figure of speech that is known as alliteration. When there is comparison between one thing and the other, we have two figures of speech: simile and metaphor. When there is a line like, it's a poem by Robert Burns, "My love is like a red, red rose." Now, when this word "like" is used, this figure of speech is that is there for comparison between the speaker's love and a red rose, a beautiful rose flower. This is explained, this comparison is there with the help of figure of speech known as simile, right? So simile is when the poet tries to compare one thing with another, and it is, this comparison is direct kind of comparison. It is there with the help of the word like. But another type of comparison is there when one thing is considered as another. Somebody is stone hearted, so heart is considered as stone. So this is metaphor. So there is this slight difference between a simile and metaphor. Metaphor is when one thing is considered as another. This is metaphor. And simile is one thing is compared to another. One thing is considered as like another, like as. So these are the words that are used to indicate this figure of speech, that is simile. There is another very common figure of speech, that is personification. When the inanimate entities, beings, things are given, are attributed human qualities, that is known as personification. For example, in a suppose there is a poem, and in that poem there is the line, "Hark, death is calling." Listen, death is calling. So here death, which is an inanimate being, entity, is given human qualities. Human beings can call one another, but here the poet poet considers death as a human being. Death, hark, he says, listen, death is calling you. Right? Where here death is given human qualities. Death is attributed with the human qualities, human features. So this figure of speech is known as personification. There is another figure of speech that is known as metonymy, when the part is considered for the whole. For example, a head is considered for the person, the heart is considered for the whole person. That figure of speech is known as the metonymy. Again, there are many figures of speech, so this is just a kind of introduction to the figures of speech. So while reading the poem, and again in case of poetry, we use the word close reading. This is close reading. Look at the form of the poem, look at the form of the stanza, how many count the number of lines in a particular stanza, and depending upon that, try to identify the stanza form, whether it's a couplet, tercet, quartet, sestet, octave, and so on. Then try to find out what kind of rhyme is used there in that poem, which figures of speech are there used there in the poem. Another technical term related to the study of a poem is the speaker. Who is the speaker? Um, Actually, who writes a poem? The poet writes a poem, right? But once that writing is done, the poet is separated from the poem, and what we have or who we have talking to us in that particular poem is the speaker. In case of a short story or in case of a novel, there is a narrator. The novelist is different, the writer is different of that particular short story or the novel, and the person who is in direct communication with the reader is the narrator there in case of a short story or a novel, whereas in case of a poem it is the speaker. When it's a personal poem, when it's a lyrical poem, usually there is a person, there is a persona who is talking to us, that is the readers. So we have to identify her or him as the person, as the speaker in the poem. The technical term is, while studying a poem, is the speaker, who the speaker is. Okay. So these are some technical terms related to the close reading of the poem. Now, after studying all these technicalities, that is the structure, the form of the poem, now let us turn to the meaning in a poem. In traditional sense, we often concentrate upon the theme of a poem, or to be more precise, the central idea of the poem. But in the modern world, in modern criticism, this central idea and the theme of the poem, it has gone to back foot. Nowadays, it is said that there is no such thing as central idea or one single theme, because there are multiple interpretations of a single poem. So it has many meanings, right? It depends upon the reader, depends upon the situation, depends upon the figures of speech used, depends upon the words that are used, and there can be multiple interpretations, there can be many explanations of a poem. But still, if we prefer the traditional way of studying a poem, we can try to find out the central idea or the theme of a poem, right? And all these things, that is the form of the poem, it contributes in giving more and more meaning to a particular poem. So it becomes very essential to study both the form and the meaning of the poem. And in order to understand again the meaning of the poem, we have to read the poem twice or thrice and mark the difficult words, the unknown words, the strange words, which are not known to us so far, and we have again to go to a dictionary and try to find out the meanings, because one word has different shades of meanings, has nuances of meanings, and we have to think about which meaning is applicable there in this context, in the context of this present poem that we are going to study. And in that way, we have to study a poem. So again, there are things like the prosodic features like meter, like rhythm, the foot in the poem, etc. But for a compulsory class, it's I think it's enough to study the stanza form, to study the type of a poem, whether a poem is a sonnet or ode, or whether it's a ballad, whether it's an elegy. Elegy is a poem of lament, when the poet writes a poem in memory of somebody near and dear to him, whom he or she had lost. So some death is there, and the poet is mourning over the death, lamenting over the death of his or her close ones. Then that poem becomes an elegy, right? So we have to identify what type of a poem is, what kind of stanza form is there, which figures of speech are used, what rhyming pattern is used in a particular poem, and so on. So in this way, we will try to read a poem, to study a poem, and appreciate a poem, and make a critical appreciation of a particular poem. And while doing all these things, don't remember that our purpose for the compulsory English course is to learn the skills of language, right? We are here to learn English language, and with the help of a poem or a short story, we have been given an opportunity to know this language, which is an important tool of empowerment in this 21st century. So this is how I think you should go to a poem and try to read that poem, try to understand that particular poem. Thank you.